there are tremendous inter-service rivalries between the Army and Navy in Japan. And it goes back to the pre-war budget wars, where Japan's a resource-poor country, and both services have what they consider absolutely essential things to be funded. Japan didn't have the money to fund both. And then when you get in war and you start expending these things, you need even more money. And so the disagreements were brutal. But before I get there, the in-group, out-group differences that stovepipe things and cause problems aren't simply between Army and Navy. They're within each service. So I'm going to start there. And to be fair, I'm going to provide one example for each service. I'll start with the Army. It was the Guangdong Army, or Japan's army in Manchuria, that decided to invade all of Manchuria back in 1931. It was not the home office back in Tokyo, but it's this branch that turns out kicks off a 15-year war. So these folks think that they know what's best for Japan and how best to defend the empire, and they're just off and running. Meanwhile, there are a series of coup attempts, some of them where Navy is part of it, a lot more of them with the Army that's dealing with it, going back and forth. And at the very end, when Emperor Hirohito is capitulating, there was one last coup attempt, which, amen, it failed, because the war might have terminated quite the way it did if it had succeeded. So the point is, if you got coups running on, that is not called unified command. It's a mess. And the Navy wasn't any better. I have a different sort of example here. During the war, the U.S. Air Service, the people who are flying planes, they would alternate combat and training missions so that you would bring back someone who had survived and learned something from combat to tell new people the things to avoid, how not to get yourself killed, and some other things. Well, in Japan, in groups, out groups, you sign up together, you train together, you fight together, and you die together. It doesn't mean the Japanese couldn't have grafted people between groups. It's just culturally, it's not the natural thing that comes to mind. Moreover, and this apparently applies to the present, that in the U.S. military, they have what are called hot washes after different operations, where you come back and you're very self-critical about all the things that went wrong to figure out how to do it better the next time. Well, there are cultural reasons why you would not want to do that in Japan. It's different. So if these in-group, out-group things are causing problems within services, it gets toxic between the services. And I've got 4 examples, and I'm going to start with organizational issues. So it's only in 1944 that the Army and Navy finally get it together to have regular liaison meetings in Tokyo. Great. Just in time to figure out how the capitulation is going to work. And then the Army wanted to unify the 2 high commands. The Navy wanted nothing to do with that one because they knew they'd just become the box lunch delivery service for the Army, didn't want to do that. So by 1945, they did unify their information department. Great. They could spew the same propaganda and maybe share Tokyo Rose on a good day. Who knows? But there was no planning, even under the imminent threat of invasion, to how they're going to coordinate their assets to protect the home island. They aren't even coordinating their air assets. Disaster. And this disaster goes back way in time. They had very far back in time. They'd had a very successful war against Russia that ends in 1905. But afterwards, in 1906, immediately afterwards, the Army and Navy are allowed to have completely separate war plans. The Army plan is all about fighting Russia for the big land grab in Eurasia. The Navy plan has a completely different set of enemies. It'd be the United States and Britain for the big gambit. You're not going to use ships in Siberia. The big gambit for empire in the Pacific. And each of these plans, A, they're secret from the other service, and B, each plan assumes the other service is going to do all kinds of important things for them. Okay, great. So I guess the idea of secrecy and surprise, normally you apply that to your enemies, not your sister service. But that's how it works in this setup. Now, the Army does come around to the Navy plan. Why? Because they get walloped by the Russians on the Mongolian border at the Battle of Nomonhan. The Russians just decimate them in 1939. So now the army says, okay, maybe that southern advance thing wasn't such a bad idea. And so the Navy thinks this is great, and they do their southern advance. They go zooming down. The Japanese mind over matter stuff seems to be going really well, because in 1942, the Army takes more land than, or a more dispersed theater than any country on the planet. The Navy hasn't lost a single ship. I mean, it's looking really good. Except there are a few little details here that are a problem. What the Navy hadn't told the Army is that actually they weren't ready for this whole thing, that they needed this outer perimeter reinforced by airfields in order to make the thing work. And that wasn't complete. And the Army learned about this on August 17th, 1942, because one of these airfields was being built in this tropical nightmare called Guadalcanal that the United States knew about, even though the Army didn't. And all of a sudden, the Navy is in deep, dark trouble and needs the Army to help them out of Guadalcanal. So now think Samurai. The Japanese 17th Army had been ordered to take Port Moresby in New Guinea. That's what they were up to. But with Guadalcanal, they are told, you need to tack on Guadalcanal to that Port Moresby event. Okay, enter logistics. They're 1,000 kilometers apart. So now the Army is going to be lying to the Navy about how many people they've got at Guadalcanal, because they're scared the Navy won't provide enough rations and things. The Navy doesn't provide enough rations. People starve anyway. And then the Navy that got the Army into this mess wants to call it off and move out, but the Army, good samurais, want to fight on, and they just expend all kinds of resources. And this thing has enormous strategic effects. Prior to Guadalcanal, the Japanese Army wanted to continue their strategy of chasing the nationalists out of China. Back in 1937, the Japanese had conquered Nanjing, which is the original nationalist capital, and the nationalists had fled up the Yangtze River to Chongqing, beyond some gorges and some other things, and beyond the rail network. And in 1943, the Japanese were planning to attack Chongqing, and then at that point, I think if you're a nationalist, you're fleeing into Burma. And if that had happened, then the Japanese could have probably pulled hundreds of thousands of people out of the China theater and put them elsewhere, and that would have caused all kinds of problems. Also, the Japanese had to call off their plans to invade Australia. So Guadalcanal has enormous strategic implications. So if you're focusing samurai on one battle, Guadalcanal, well, it has implications in places called China and Australia that are a long way off. Okay, the United States also had inter-service rivalries, right, between our Army and Navy, and that's why you have two separate campaigns for Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur. Big egos, one campaign for each ego, and apparently that wasn't even big enough for MacArthur, okay? But even so, I don't believe the inter-service rivalries in the United States were remotely on the scale that they were in Japan. I have one final example to prove that one. So after Pearl Harbor, that had been tremendously successful for Admiral Yamamoto. He wanted to do, the next thing was to attack Midway, because U.S. basing there. And the Army said, we're not going to do this. And Yamamoto goes, I'm going to resign. And the Army, we don't care. I'll commit suicide. We'll buy popcorn. And here's what changes this. So after Pearl Harbor, Americans wanted to let the Japanese know that we were thinking about them. And so this is where Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, the Doolittle raids named after him, in April 1942, it was a one-way trip off an aircraft carrier because they had so much fuel in order to get to Japan, that the idea was they're going to go bomb Japan and then ditch in China whoever survives. Very brave people who did this. And are they going to cause massive damage in Japan? Well, yeah, if you're directly underneath, you won't appreciate it. But in general, it causes minor damage. But it has a major, unanticipated strategic benefit. Think samurai. The Army all of a sudden is backing the Navy, that they're going to now do Midway with them. And it's right, don't think, retaliate, avenge your honor. The Army was appalled that anyone had been able to bomb Japanese skies, so now they're all over it. Okay, so how does Midway work out? Really poorly for the Japanese. They lose 4 aircraft carriers. They've only got 12. They've lost a third. Oops. And here we go, in-group, out-group. The Navy doesn't tell anyone for 3 or 4 months. Incredible in a war, right? So they're thinking about their little stovepipe, and they're ignoring Japanese interests.